Let's just first make sure that everyone is here. OG.
Yep.
OO.
Here.
Yes.
CG. CG, are you here?
Yep,
Yeah,
I'm
I
here.
can.
Great. And CO?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the semifinals of Astana Open. Well done for reaching so far in the competition, and I wish you all good luck in the semifinal. Before we begin, let's do a short introduction, first of the panelists, and then each team. I'll ask you to tell me your speaking order and if you have any gender preference pronunciation. Let's start with the panel.
Jack, no preference.
Lena and Shio, they pronounce it fine.
Great, thank you. OG? You're muted.
Hi, my name's Ron. I'll be speaking first. He, they.
Arie speaking, so I can't hear that. It's fine. So
Eyal speaking first, Boaz speaking second, both no preference.
All right, INCG, Mukhtar speaking first. Jose, please.
and Nurzhan speaking second, no preference.
Josh will be speaking first. He or they is fine.
Nicole speaking second, she, please.
Great, thank you all. So for the motion, this House believes that government agencies that regulate vaccines should only test whether a vaccine is safe, not whether it is effective, before approving it for public use. I'm more than welcome to call the Prime Minister.
Sorry, can you give me 1 second? I just need to arrange my notes. Okay, this is before I start my speech, so don't start the timer yet, but I'm aware because I'm being streamed and potentially recorded, there will be a large amount of scientific content within my speech. I'm reasonably confident in it, but sorry, I'm very confident in everything I'm going to say. Nonetheless, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a public health official. If you are watching this on stream, or if you're watching this on YouTube, treat this as, you know, a normal debate and people are just saying stuff. Don't like go out and cite me or change your life behavior or whatever. With that caveat out of the way, cool. 3, hang on, sorry, yeah, 3, 2, 1. This is, you know, as CAs often do, set debate motions which they think are interesting ideas, and I agree that it is an interesting idea. However, it is also the status quo to, like, literally in all countries all over the world, and there's very good hard scientific reasons to justify why that is the case, which is going to be the bulk of my speech. So sorry, Op, I don't know what you're going to do. The second thing is, Op, I'm not sure what your counterfactual is. The motion makes it really unclear. So at the 1 minute mark, I'd like you to tell me if you stand behind approving vaccines that are unsafe but effective, or if you demand both safety and efficacy, because otherwise I have no idea what I'm arguing against. Cool, so onto this. Our case is very simple. As we say, this is the status quo, and there's good reasons for this, which largely revolve around the difficulty in terms of the production, i.e. literally the creation of doses of vaccines compared to conventional drugs, and secondly, around the ability to deploy as quickly as possible, and the way in which efficacy is measured for vaccines is quite unlike other drugs in the sense that it is literally impossible to quantify what it means for a vaccine to be efficacious, and therefore it is easier to err on the side of caution and simply get it out as quickly as possible. You'll understand what I mean. One caveat here. If one contention they have is that this will be abused by pharmaceutical companies in order to pump out and make lots of money from vaccines that are safe per our side of the motion, but do not work, no, this would be a massive hit to the reputation of a pharmaceutical company and would, limit their ability to access capital and such in the future. And thus they're unlikely to jeopardize their reputation by basically stealing public money. So I don't think that's relevant in this debate. Now, Op, tell me what your counterfactual is. Either one of you, I don't care. Well, actually, OO, because you're the ones who get to pick it. Come on.
I'm not sure what you mean by your characterization of the status quo. Like the reason it's taking so long to develop a COVID vaccine, the reason it took so long to develop an HIV vaccine is because there are medium to high thresholds for the safety before it can be released in the status quo.
So I asked for the counterfactual, which is really frustrating, but whatever. I'm going to assume that they are going to demand both safety and efficacy, because otherwise I don't know how I can continue having this debate. Cool. So what is safety and efficacy within the realm or the science of virus production? Firstly, the way vaccinations against viruses work is very different to the drugs that most of you are familiar with taking. So let me partition them into two different things. We have small drug molecules, which are essentially very small, as in they contain usually under 100 atoms, and they are designed to bind to a protein somewhere within your body and modify the operation of that protein in a way that changes the physiological structure of your body. The complexity there is that because a molecule is very small, it can attach to lots of different molecules around your body. And so a drug that maybe it works for one thing, you may not realize has also bound and connected to lots of other different parts of the body, lots of other different organs, lots of other different proteins, and therefore can quite a lot later often produce quite substantial harm. That is completely different to how vaccines work, which is where you take a form of a virus, often modified or deactivated, i.e. you kill the virus, you prevent its ability to replicate, and you supply a dose of that into a person's bloodstream, such that the immune system, which works by recognizing viruses that is dealt with previously and reproducing molecules called antibodies, which basically wrap around the virus and like deactivate it as quickly as possible. So if you introduce an inactive version of the vaccine, it can't produce an infection because that virus cannot replicate, but it does mean that the immune system is able to generate the antibodies, which mean that in the future it will be able to recognize the virus and more quickly respond with an immune response and shut down an infection if it is exposed to the real virus. The reason, therefore, why the safety of vaccines is a criteria that is relatively easy to establish is because if you introduce a deactivated form of a vaccine into someone's body, what you're looking for in the safety trials is, did we deactivate it properly, or is it going to cause an infection? Obviously, if it causes an infection, it's not safe, but otherwise there is no risk because it is a virus molecule which the body which literally cannot bind to things. It is quite large and it cannot interact with proteins in the way that small drug molecules work. So that's why this is entirely unlike pharmaceutical production in the traditional sense when we're dealing with small drug molecules, and that's why safety is very easy to evaluate. But efficacy, on the other hand, is something that is nearly impossible to quantify because the immune response that I just described, which is the goal of a vaccine, has an indefinite period, i.e. we can tell by doing scientific analysis basically on people's blood, did they generate the antibody response as a result of exposure to the vaccine? But what we can't measure is how long that antibody response will survive. So we don't know how long they will be immune for. And what we also can't measure is how resilient that antibody response is to modifications of the virus. So if the virus mutates, the antibodies may no longer be a good enough match in order to facilitate an immune response to future versions of the virus. So what I want you to establish here is safety is something we can work out quite quickly. Did this person get infected? So within a period of like 6 months, we can conduct detailed, rigorous safety trials on a vaccine. What we won't know, basically, for years is whether the immune response is permanent. However, this is important because the complexity of manufacturing drug molecules is very quick. You can scale drug molecules up very quickly. But to mass produce doses of vaccines is really difficult because you have to grow loads of these virus molecules and generate massive amounts of them. So that's really important because if you've got an infection like COVID right now, which is spreading very quickly through the population, every month that you delay in order to measure the efficaciousness of the vaccine is going to be like another million people infected. And of course, that is an exponential growth that's going to lead to massive amounts of death. So it's far more important that at the point at which we can establish a degree of safety within the vaccine trials, we start moving forward with production so that by the event like we already have, as it is right now, millions, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines being prepared. The moment those safety trials are cleared, we can start mass distributing that all over the world and we can get large amounts of the population vaccinated and slow down the spread of the pandemic. If we also have to wait 6 months, a year, however long it is, to establish how long that immune response is, i.e. the efficacy, millions of people would have unnecessarily died. So the reason, furthermore, I think why this is really important, even if it does mean that we have to have multiple iterations of vaccination programs because the first one generated a short-lived immune response when we need to modify the vaccine in order to get a longer-term immune response, is the massive benefit of this is that we generate enormous amounts of data. So there are currently multiple strains of COVID, for example, in different continents, etc. And while we are currently very confident that the vaccine will work against all of them because they've not mutated very heavily, if we are able to distribute early versions safe, our burden in the motion, of the vaccine, we can test how they respond to the different the different mutations of coronavirus around the world. And that means that the second generation vaccines that we generate now operate on millions of data points. Now, all of this basically means is that because vaccination programs are quite unlike all other forms of drugs, they are treated by public bodies in terms of the regulation of them also very differently. And that is, as I say, down to the chemistry of the two different things. So at the end of the day, what the opposition needs to stand behind is allowing literally millions of people die from preventable infections against the trade-off of potentially we may have to roll out 2, 3, 4 vaccination programs rather than just one final one. This is the status quo for a good reason. It saves lives. Vote government.
I thank the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call the leader of opposition here.
Right, just a sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So I just wanted to start my speech with my argument, but we have to recognize what we've been brought by the Prime Minister. So our comparative is really clear. We think that the status quo is actually on our side. We think that we are checking both efficacy and safety. And we think that if, for example, a certain vaccination is immensely effective in immunizing a majority of people against very serious diseases, we are accepting some kind of educated risk. For example, I've been told by my partner that the papilloma vaccine have some educated risk. It means that some of the women that will take this vaccine might have some side effect, but because it prevents cancer, we are obviously for that. But on the other hand, if you have a vaccine against flu that creates something, I don't know, the same kind of side effects, we won't approve that because cancer is more deadly. So we think it should be a case by case, and we think that is the status quo. Also regarding to COVID, this is obviously an outlier, right? You have like thousands of diseases and thousands of things, but in the status quo, you have a certain emergency route that didn't give corona. Since we are the side that protects the status quo, we don't have to protect thousands and millions of dead people. Sorry, Ron, that was just not fair. Thank you, Mukhtar, for that applause. So let's go to our case. While we have to concede that the vaccination that will be approved under government side won't be risky by themselves, or maybe not as risky as some vaccination that have approved efficacy. We think that they are mutually exclusive with two very important things: A, effective vaccinations, and B, some other effective vaccination that will be delayed or won't even be produced or manufactured when you have not effective vaccination that were approved or solely on the fact that they are not dangerous, that they are safe, and B, responsible behavior by the population. So what we are talking about, we think that probably the FDA won't tell you that a certain vaccination is effective if they didn't check them themselves. But the people will very likely think that the vaccination will be effective. A, because it still have some kind of FDA seal of approval, and we are not sure that people are really into like going to the nuance, what is just safe, what is safe and effective. But more than that, we think that the company very likely will proclaim that, or will make a very misleading advertisement that will lead you to believe that. We think that some research will be done on this vaccination after it's been produced. We think some of that will proclaim that is effective. Some of those people might want to work for the pharmaceutical industry, or might even get now things, so they have like bias. But even if they're not biased, we think that for everything you have like contradicting research, and some research will be done that will persuade people that it's effective. The pharmaceutical industry will have all the means and intentions to proclaim and to like emphasize the research that they want. So in the end of the day, people will think it's effective. So why it's a problem? Because we think that it is a problem because it's mutually exclusive with other things that would actually improve the state, the efficacy of vaccination of the pharmaceutical industry. What we're talking about? First of all, about other vaccinations for the same diseases that are actually effective and actually good. Why? Because the process of approving a vaccination that are both effective and safe is much longer, because if you just want to prove that something is not dangerous, this takes like 2 or 3 years, but other than you need a decade just to prove efficacy. That's how the process is going by now. So if you have like a new disease and you have a couple of pharmaceutical companies competing one another, we think that the one that is just going for the safe and not necessarily effective will just will be the first to approve and will have like the market share, and the rest of the companies don't know if it's effective or not effective. But at the point that people believe it's effective, and at the point that people will get that vaccination, this is another risk that the pharmaceutical companies take beyond the regulatory risk, beyond the risk that it's very hard and very expensive to make those vaccinations. We think that at the point that pharmaceutical companies have more risks, they are less likely to do that, or they might delay, and we have like years in delay vaccinations that are actually effective on the expense that we now have like a not effective but really safe vaccination. More than that, we think that maybe a more effective vaccination is also like kind of dangerous, but now it won't kill you, but it has some side effects, and people don't like side effects. Or at the point that they say we have one vaccination that is completely safe and another that is we are told it will be effective, but it has side effects, they will go with the one without the side effects, even though it's not really effective. We prefer people to take the effective vaccination, even if it have some side effects. Before I move on, I would really like closing. No?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, no, actually.
All right, opening, yeah.
The side effects that you describe as the consequence of administering a vaccine occur from the immune response of your body. So that means the maximum period of time over which we can experience side effects is like 2 months to 6 months in the most extreme cases. So we can establish safety in 6 months. Like, as I said, efficacy would take minimum like another year.
Thank you. Thank you. So we think that people who have side effects for like 2 months or half a year don't want that, and we think that some cases vaccination, if it have side effects, we prefer you take that than other vaccinations that don't have side effects but they don't cure your problem. So we think that's a thing. And my second speaker will I don't know, like recognize if there's something else to say about it. We think that it's also like mutually exclusive with preventive behavior. For example, people, when we're talking about STDs, will less likely put a condom on, or people when they think they have like a vaccination from a flu or something like that, if they know that they have a family member or a friend that is having this disease, they are less likely to like prevent themselves from going to them because they think they are vaccinated, but they are in fact don't have an effective vaccination. We think that preventive for example, we see now with the corona, when people are not taking seriously the dangers, they do dangerous stuff, dumb stuff. We want people to not think they are immune when they don't have the immune. If they are led to do, they want to do preventive stuff that will actually prevent that. So for this reason, I call you to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition, and I'm happy to call the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me well? Yeah, cool. Just a few seconds, I'm sorry. Sorry, just 5 seconds. Yeah. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Look, what we are proving to you here is we believe that in all cases, with regards to where in the long run we'll have a better vaccines that will work, but also with regards to how the society will respond to it and be actually will opt in all of the tests and vaccination in general, but also with regards to the efficacy in the end of the day of the vaccine, we are getting better results. I will explain it with regards to why effectiveness is in general a problematic factor to be considered in the first place, but also why on the comparative it's being considered in priority over the safety, and this is hugely problematic in status quo because of this of the narrative over effectiveness in general. Furthermore, I will go further with the explanation on what are side effects, problems, and how we actually get better in our side of the house with all of the problems that they are describing. Most of the rebuttal will be integrated. But before that, just a few points. So what they're saying is basically, well, look, side effects are not that problematic. This is still fine, right? At least you won't die from cancer. This is hugely mischaracterized issue. What side effects are and what is its problems? First of all, considering the fact that you're reducing on their side of the house the value of safety, meaning that at some point of time you're issuing the vaccine that considered effective but not safe enough because you believe that it will cure the disease more likely than it might cause anything else, but you're not sure that it's necessarily true. What does it mean? It means that first of all, it's irrelevant for the majority of this debate because when you make a vaccine, you're infusing basically the virus there, so the direct result will be probably the illness. But even if we're talking about not just a vaccine, but rather like double drugs or something like that, we believe that this is also problematic. Why? Because first of all, side effects are very unpredictable because you cannot expect for sure what our side effects will be and what specifically you will get when you're scaling and issuing the vaccine in the world. But the problem is that you will not prove it and scrutinize it to the proper extent because you will believe that efficiency and efficacy of this vaccine is good enough so that you can risk this side effects. What is problematic here is because considering the fact that it's unpredictable in and of itself because you don't know for sure what it's going to be, but second of all, scalable to the shit ton of people who will get this vaccine, and we believe that it's problematic because it causes a huge outcry of health issues that people will get, even if they will get to more likely some likelihood of curing the disease that the vaccine is trying to cure, they will get a lot of problems that they didn't actually want to get. Where it works specifically problematic in the developing countries or in countries in Africa where people are tested for the problematic people or like from poor backgrounds who don't have much of an access to the healthcare and possibility for them to treat all of the possible diseases, which no matter if it's cancer or you just have a really like sick flu, you're getting really big problems for your life because you can't go to work now, you can't actually go outside, you're literally dying because you can't actually go to the hospital. And let's be real, not all of these test groups will be that efficient that anyone who can possibly get a side effect from the already issued vaccine that will spread throughout the world will get a subsidized healthcare something for all the side effects that might come, meaning that you're expanding the level and amount of a lot of problems and diseases on an unpredictable amount of people, especially who are suffering in the places where they cannot afford the fair and normal treatment in the healthcare. This is unfair to those people, but also this is basically creating much more harm. Why is it mainly problematic in terms of the efficacy? Because we believe that, as my teammate has already explained, first of all, efficacy by the science issue, science nature of it, is unpredictable. Why? Because specifically in the vaccine, we're discussing specifically vaccine, not just drugs, we believe that it's hard to predict whether it will be full or not, because the reaction that you can get from the antibodies, the reaction of antibodies that you can get from infusing the vaccine, it might be recent, it might be right away, but it will not necessarily last for a long time. The problem is that why? Because the body can change, and considering the fact that the virus mutates, it means means that you might get and not necessarily that effective vaccine, but you will get all of the outcry of the possible problems that you are having, but also the reverse diseases because of it's not effective enough. The problem is that efficacy is considered as by the people and by the government as something which is which is good. Why? Because efficacy basically means that it cures the disease. People don't really buy into whether it will work or not. They believe that this is like a landmark case which will cure everyone, so they are likely to approve and support efficacy over safety just because you don't want to die from cancer rather than you will get some kind of flu side effect, which is still not good enough. But me and the government who want to be the first in the race of vaccines are also likely to buy into the efficacy shit because they want to issue the vaccines first, which will be the most efficient. Considering what my partner told you, that efficacy in and of itself does not work in the way people think it does, and considering the fact that there's huge problems in the future, we believe that you are screwing over even more people. Why we have a better way, like better life, better treatment on our side. We believe that first of all, we get a more efficiency in the end of the day. Why? Because you're issuing the safe, but even if not that effective vaccine, but safe vaccine that you can actually that will not lead to the huge outcry of other side effects, but will show you how this vaccine works on the huge amount of people who are not dying from this vaccine, but maybe will not be cured right away. Well, considering the fact that this is serious diseases that cannot be cured right away, we believe that it's hugely important because this data shows you how this vaccine works on multiple samples of reaction on different groups of people with different characteristics, which means that in the end of the day, you will get the more and better vaccine after all. But lastly, we believe that it drastically increases the trust of the society by vaccine. Look, the main argument of anti-vax movement is that you're infusing the illness and disease into my child's body. We are killing this argument because we are showing that we are issuing a safe vaccine that even if it don't work necessarily, it will at least not kill your child and might get him live a better life. What does it mean? Not only for anti-vax movement, but for general society in general, you're easier to opt out from multiple trials, even if you need to have multiple trials for the sake of the efficiency of the following vaccines. You have a better support from the society to test multiple vaccines, considering the possible mutations of the viruses and the possible problems that you need to do these retrials. We believe that it's better for the society to be more acceptable on that rather than not. For all these reasons, we beg you to propose. Thanks.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Can you hear me? Great. One little moment. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. The assumption from side government that they know better than the FDA how to weigh between effectiveness and safety of medicines and vaccine is quite ridiculous. We do not understand why a group of people that studied all their lives how epidemiology works, how vaccines are effective or ineffective, do not have the ability to understand when they should actually sign off on a vaccine and actually make the decision between how much safety it needs, how much efficient it needs to be. Therefore, we believe that all their case about, but they want this to be effective as possible is actually flipping to their side, because when the FDA doesn't agree on anything but safety, here comes a governmental push that is not actually supported by any facts, because effectiveness hasn't been tested. When effectiveness is tested, then against the governmental push, the FDA as an independent organization can come and say, no, we need to test that and that effectiveness. Moreover, they tell us, look, now, look, now they want to make it as effective and not as safe as possible. We think companies want to get FDA approval. That is their first goal. Then they want to sell as much as possible their vaccines in order to get as much funds as possible. Therefore, I think they want to make their vaccines good in order to be accepted and sold. Let's move into my arguments. Firstly, I will talk about why we need to weigh between safety and effectiveness of vaccine. And secondly, I will talk about the harm of ineffective vaccine in the long term. Before I move on, I would very much like a CG's extension in my speech. Even if now, if you want. Yes. Yes.
Sure. So there is a ton of different diseases that don't get vaccines now because it's not commercially viable. Do you think we should let people die, or should we change something about it?
Well, I don't agree for the assumption let people die. I think we let people die all the times. I think this is how medicine works. Some people have to die because we don't develop everything, because we don't have enough people for everything. I will talk about that later. So, first argument. Firstly, we say there are vaccines that are inherently not very safe. As we say, the papilloma against uterine cancer, and there are more. We think that that vaccines are more developed, and it is in things that we haven't found easy vaccine. The more advanced vaccines have a high chance of being more risky. We think that is something that we need to accept. Now, when we accept that, we need to understand that we should weigh between the two. It is quite intuitive. I don't want a vaccine against allergy to be very risky, but a vaccine against cancer, maybe I will give to some people quite risky. Now, according to everything that OG has said to us and no response from them, they need to defend the side where that vaccine against allergy and that vaccine against cancer have the same safety standards. And this is crucial because the safety, cannot be, because even if that means that you need now to develop one more year that cancer treatment, then that means many people die. This is exactly flipping what Ron has told you about how many people are dying, because we think that on our side, when you now don't need that very high rate of safety for some vaccines, you can roll them earlier. Most things we say that companies have now much less incentive into investigating things that are less likely to be safe. We think that things for cancer, for example, diabetes, when we talk about even AIDS, are things that are likely to be of some risk because they are not just bacteria or viruses that you can just wipe off, but they are more complicated. Some of these are things that the body does to itself. Therefore, it creates and changes things that are not so easy as Ron told you they are. That means that you need to invest, and now when you understand that it is very, very hard to get such vaccine actually accepted, you as a company are much less likely to invest in such things. Now, going into what CG said, since this is exactly crucial on things that affect the third world. Why? Because we think that in the third world, unfortunately, we do not have much money to spend on the vaccines. That means today companies have less incentive. But now, when these companies don't only need to make safe vaccines and not effective vaccines, they are much more inclined to not make them even effective as to sell something to the third world, as it is a new market that evolves. We think that when you can even say, yes, I am selling that to the third world because there is no alternative, then you are in a better position to actually give that even for the third world in the most crucial areas. Here's the very important thing. We, on our side of the house, can accept a specific cure, even if it is quite unsafe, for the patients with the worst status, who are likely going to die if they don't get it. On their side, they need to get something that is a wet blanket ban on anything that they do, because they talk only about safety and not of its effectiveness. Let's move into the second argument. Why it won't be effective if we have ineffective vaccines. We do agree that the vaccines are likely to be somewhat effective in some sense, but this is important. We think that when you spread one vaccine, this is firstly a huge logistical challenge, always, of course, in times of emergency. The COVID-19 cure will be most problematic when shipping it to all of the world in -80 degrees, etc. That is much more problematic when you want to send another vaccine 3 years later. We think this is less likely to be spread. Why? Firstly, it just costs really amounts of money to on that logistic and to bring that, etc. Second, people don't like to go to the doctor another time, especially people whose doctor is like 50 kilometers away from their house. Moreover, there is less belief in the system as a whole because wait, you told me it is the right vaccine. No one getting a vaccine asks, wait, what company is it? They tell you, yeah, that's a vaccine against that. You assume that it's good. If you are infected with that, or they tell you you need a new vaccine, you are less likely to believe in the system. You are less likely to buy any other new vaccine, and you are less likely, and you are more likely to be anti-vaxxer. This is actually flipping the belief, but causing it even more exactly in the places that there isn't today. I mean, people in Africa where there aren't anti-vaxxers, but when they tell you, take another vaccine, that will work, the belief in the system is worse. But moreover, the incentive to invent more vaccines and better vaccines after one ineffective has spread is much less because less people will buy it in the first place because they already got some vaccine which they don't know its effectiveness and it costs so much. For all these reasons, I call you to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader for position, and I'm happy to call the government member here.
Can you hear me? Cool. Give me just 30 seconds to set up my papers. All right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to do in my speech is pretty simple. I'm not going to only focus on COVID because we do truly believe that there's a lot of stuff that goes beyond regular regulations with COVID, and therefore it's not very relevant for this debate. What we're going to be talking about is about how we're likely to get vaccines for commercially unviable diseases, those diseases that are in Africa, in South America, and that affect the most vulnerable people in the world. We believe it happens more in our side. We're going to explain that. Before that, a few points of refutation to opening up. So what opening up seems to claim is that right now companies will not have incentives to create effective vaccines, and therefore everyone will lose their trust into vaccines, and they're just going to be bad, etc. So we don't really buy into that. Why? First, realistically, for overwhelming most of diseases that you could have a commercially viable, vaccine at the moment, you already have vaccine because a ton of companies want to make money off, say, having a vaccine for flu, and a ton of companies develop vaccines for flu, and there's a whole variety of vaccines like that on the market that are very, very effective already. You don't necessarily need new vaccines all the time. For overwhelming most of diseases, you already have some kind of vaccine, like literally in Kazakhstan, we get same shots that we got in Soviet Union, they work fairly well. Second thing is that given that we're talking about diseases like that, you get a lot of competition for overwhelming most of those diseases that are quite important and affect a lot of people, and therefore are likely to affect public trust into vaccines or something like that, because a lot of companies are probably scrambling to get their government tenders, etc., in order to get their money. Therefore, it's likely that you're going to have still quite viable, quite efficient vaccines, even if you don't require efficiency, because it's just commercially better for those companies to put out efficient vaccines in order to outcompete other companies, because they're going to be judged about their efficiency by government officials, for example, when they decide who to buy out 1 million vaccines from in order to, get shots to their schoolies or something like that. So it's likely to happen. What is important in this debate is not stuff like that can affect a lot of people. We're talking about rare diseases that don't get vaccines at the moment, because that's where the question is at. So look, as opening government said, testing safely is apparently very easy and very cheap and super generic, and basically is the same for basically every disease. Therefore, it's not something that takes a lot of time or a lot of money, right? Same thing is that, some level of efficiency is kind of guaranteed because you're doing more or less of the same thing. Maybe it's not super long lasting, but it might be long lasting. You're at least going to get some level of effect about this thing, right? But testing efficiency, on the other hand, is outstanding long, but we believe it's also outstandingly expensive for you because of the length, but also because of the fact, for example, that you have to hire control groups and experiment groups in controlled environments. You have to infect a ton of people with those diseases in order to check out how they correlate with placebo, people who are given placebos, etc. That requires you to hire a lot of people from different backgrounds, of different, genders, races, age, etc., which is outstandingly expensive because you have to track them, all of those people, for like 1 or 1.5 year, whatever, like Ron said, which is all extremely expensive. And given that you have limited R&D capabilities, even as big pharma, because, doing such stuff is not very easy, and you have only limited amount of scientists. It's just something that most companies don't tend to do for smaller, diseases or diseases from certain places, because it's just not commercially viable for you to spend literal millions upon millions, or like literal billions probably dollars on those things. So why should you care about that? Because we think that there are lots and lots and lots of diseases that are really problematic, but for which vaccines are not developed. First of all, we're talking mostly about vaccines that affect very poor regions. For example, look at Ebola, right? Ebola mostly spreads because you don't have proper water treatment facilities, you don't have proper sewage, so that's why it's mostly a problem in Africa, sadly. Or there's, for example, a lot of diseases that are spread by mosquitoes, different, like hundreds types of different fevers that are extremely deadly and that are spread in different regions of South America. You can have a generic vaccine for that, like you can have for dengue or something like that, but you still can have some level of vaccines for that. It's just very, very hard for you to test throughout those hundreds different types of vaccines, although making them is fairly cheap, which means that in overwhelming most of cases, there are no vaccines for these problems, and people in those regions do not get any kind of treatment. They just get disease and they die afterwards. So what happens now is that, big players find these vaccines pretty unprofitable, and pharma is highly profit driven, because first of all, you don't want to spend your R&D power on something that doesn't lend you money when you can spend it on something that will take out money from, say, USA, which will literally pay you so much money in insurance that even one person that you save in USA costs you, gives you more money than saving like 1,000 people in Africa. It's just a fairly cheap calculation like that. And again, Ebola is a pretty clear example here. Ebola exists since the 70s. Only recently it got to be a threat for European states. We get a vaccine fairly instantly, which means that it's realistic that you can make vaccines for places like that as soon as you see that it's economically viable, because now people in Europe also want to get this kind of a vaccine. Therefore, it's something that those companies realistically can do. They just choose not to do because of the fact that it's commercially unviable, right? So what happens now is that likely you will care about those cases because of the fact that, well, making a generic vaccine is just so much more cheaper. And because of that, you just basically have to, do some basic testing about safety, and then you're free to print out your vaccines and, spread them out, only charging as much as they are cost to produce, plus some extra revenue, which will still generate revenue for you, and therefore is still a venture that you would like to take as a company. Before I continue, I'll take opening up.
Yes. We analyze that when vaccines are only tested by safety, every company wants to be the first creating the vaccine. The first company will be the only one successful, thus creating no incentive.
Amazing. Yeah. We get that logic. So that's exactly where this part of the extension comes in. So what we believe happens now also is that you don't actually only get Pfizer making vaccines for Ebola or something like that, because we have a ton of different producers of medicine all around the world, especially in India and places like that, but there are also basically local level producers in basically every country in the world that would love to compete on this market, but because regulation is so expensive and they are not Pfizer, don't have money to do that, they have to rely on just producing generics, stuff like that they license from other companies that could have afforded to make those tests. Now you don't have to run all of those super expensive tests, which means that you as a local company or as an Indian company can compete with Pfizer's on those markets in particular. And even if your vaccine is not as necessarily good as Pfizer's vaccine, it's still going to do some work, and therefore you're going to be able to damp the price of Pfizer's vaccine, and you're also going to be able to compete with them on efficiency, which means that there is going to be some level of competition. Sure, the vaccines are not going to be very efficient, because if they're going to be very efficient, that's going to be unviable economically, but they're going to be somewhat efficient to the extent that it is available, which is still better than just not having anything at all. But it's a better world, both CG.
I think the member of government, I'm happy to call the member of opposition here.
Hi, are you able to hear me okay? Sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm not missing all of the funky things that have been said in this debate so far. Okay. Panel, this has been a really confusing debate with OG trying to flip the script on what the status quo actually looks like. I think the status quo very much is one where there's a prioritization of both safety and efficacy at the same time. I'll actually give you structural reasons why that's the case, but I also think that's just what we intuitively see in terms of how long it's taking to develop a coronavirus vaccine, how long we still don't have like a pure vaccine for the influenza, how long it took to develop HIV vaccine. We still don't have one. I'll explain why that's the case. I'm going to do a couple things in this speech. First, I'm going to answer two outstanding questions that most of government bench relies on, but then before bringing you the extension about how this changes government funding of vaccine research, because private funding still exists in either world. Okay, first question. One, why OG can't have their cake and eat it? When Ron says it's really easy to still develop effective vaccines whilst accelerating the research process and releasing them safely, I just think that this is wrong, right? I think OO challenges this by saying, no, vaccine viruses are complicated. They're viruses that, for example, have you attack yourself. I'm not sure which to believe, so I'm going to give you 4 conclusive reasons why efficacy takes such a long time. You can accelerate the process and achieve it. First, viruses are extraordinarily adaptable. They mutate. This is particularly true of virus branches like MARS or SARS, which are the most violent and the most deadly, or the virus you're probably familiar with, like HIV. Secondly, I think that this ignores the fact that there are multiple strains of the viruses. So to the extent in which, even if you are able to accelerate the process and perhaps only hit one strain, there are multiple other strains that if you don't take the time to research and provide a vaccine that perhaps can access all of them, you end up creating a situation where people have to go get the flu vaccine every year anyways, which they end up not doing, and it becomes ineffective. And so it does take a long time to develop something that works. Thirdly, vaccines are not as easy as just creating a dead version of it and injecting it, like Ron says. Like, other people in the round know about vaccines too. It's like you have to find which of the biological, which of like the chemical byproducts that it produces, or which of the surface proteins that it has, in which combination of those things will actually create the situation where it can inoculate yourself against the virus while not creating any negative externalities like recreating the virus that we're so concerned about. It's really difficult, and it's not as easy as Ron packages it. And lastly, you have to do all of these things while maintaining the fact that a very adaptable, mutatable virus, and all viruses are this, it's one of their evolutionary like underpinning components, you have to do so because if you inject it into someone while manipulating the proteins or manipulating the chemical byproducts, you could potentially create a virus that is even more adaptable, or that has an even different strain that would exist in the status quo, which is a huge risk, which is why people in the status quo take so long to check for efficacy before releasing it, right? And so even if like vaccines that they're releasing are fast-tracked but safe, we think that you're compromising extraordinarily on the amount of efficacy that they're likely to see because of these 4 difficulties, right? I think that these reasons are also a much better reason than the kind of like side effects clash that you get, like, what happens when you fast-track and maybe that there are some side effects. I think when you fast-track and ineffective vaccines are creating the possibility of more strains or more adaptable viruses, which can then create a global pandemic like HIV did, I think that's a much more significant harm. And then OG tries to flip their case in the DPM by saying, but in the comparative on your side, you're going to see an increased emphasis on efficacy over safety, which is bad. Here's the thing. The 4 reasons I gave you show why efficacy is so hard to achieve. So I'll actually posit to you that when I'll embrace that characterization that we do have an overemphasis on efficacy precisely because it's so hard to achieve, and therefore it's a positive counterbalancing mechanism on our side that actually allows us to produce vaccines that end up being effective whilst also maintaining like the safety, because like politicians don't want to release vaccines that end up killing everybody. Okay, then the second thing OG says, and this is really interesting, is that we'll release safe but ineffective vaccines in order to collect millions of data points. 2 problems with this. The first is just like processing capacity. To the extent to which you have millions of data points, like the limited amount of people on your team or limited amount of processing power that you have in your computers, you can't go through all of it once, which makes a lot of it irrelevant. You don't need that much. What you need is probably the amount that they research in labs. And secondly, a lot of it's irrelevant because you only need a certain percentage of demographics within a population to understand how the vaccine interacts with it. Anything more than that is irrelevant and literally wastes your time, slows you down. So that point doesn't stand. Okay. Two pieces of framing. One, I think a lot of the vaccines that we're talking about in this debate, although COVID is really easy to latch onto, have to do with things like mumps, measles, like more chronic or more things that do still kill people that last around for a long time unless people get the vaccines, and that's why they're so important. And then secondly, that the private sector is still researching. What is the extension that we're bringing you? We're bringing you the extension that the ways that optics around vaccines change means that governments put less effort and less research into them for a couple different reasons. And why governments end up putting less funding and less research into them is what's going to win us the round. What are the reasons this is true? One, complacency, right? OO says, companies are going to compete to be the first to produce an effective vaccine. I think complacency of the government knowing that the private sector is going to keep researching it is a better link here, because theirs relies on companies changing their behavior, whereas ours relies on the companies just doing what they do in the status quo and continuing to research at the exact same amount. The government knows that companies are going to continue to research. The government knows that there's still a profit incentive. And so there's less motivation to allocate funding and resources towards this, because there's a less of a likelihood that it's even going to be effective anyways when you fast track it, like I've shown you on prop. Politicians and people who make funding decisions in the government are just less likely to want to pour more money or keep even the same amount of money into something when you're compromising on the ability to ever be efficacious with your money, when you know the private sector is going to do it anyways. You might as well put that money somewhere else. You know the private sector is going to keep going. The second thing is that when you release ineffective vaccines, you get less public support. People are like, why are you wasting our money? Why are you wasting our budget on this if you're just producing vaccines that are ineffective because you structurally change the rules and policies to allow yourself to release vaccines that are ineffective? And so this change means that it's less politically viable to do this. Politicians are going to be less in support of this because they have to appeal to their constituency. I think the third link here is that people are going to be far more confused and unwilling to be allocating money into this because there's going to be so much misinformation around vaccines and what their actual efficacy is due to advertising campaigns by all the different companies that are marketing and trying to create vaccines. You're never going to know how effective vaccines are, the ones especially that are being produced by the government, because the government's going to say one thing and then a private company is going to say another because they're trying to get you to use them. The fourth link here is that there's the heightened social and political power of anti-vaxxers. And I think this wins the top hash clash on anti-vaxxers because OG says they'll be fine with it because it's not killing them. OO says they'll have less faith in public health. I win this right away by explaining to you, because that's where OO's analysis stops, that a galvanized anti-vax movement has far more political capital. They have far more funding. They have far more members because the government has literally acknowledged that vaccines aren't effective anymore, and that draws people in, that makes them interest. They're gonna be featured more in debate. They're gonna be platformed more because it's now a more legitimate position. The government has acknowledged that they're partially correct. Lots of impacts here. The first is a larger movement means more reach, more effect, less people vaccinating their kids, literally more children dying. The second is that when the government has less funding and is able to pour less into public vaccine research, that means people are less able to access it. Because when the private sector is predominantly the one researching it, they either make it more expensive directly to the consumer, or they make it more expensive by selling it at a really high price to the government, and then the government has to trade off those costs back to the consumers, which disproportionately affects persons of color and other people who rely on public healthcare, right? I think that we've already answered a lot of the key questions in the round. I think that Nicole is definitely going to be showing you why the ways in which change and less government funding, less government emphasis into research ultimately wins us the round. Thank you.
I think the member of opposition, I'm happy to call the government whip. Here.
1 second. Okay, let's start. 1, 2, 3. Unlike closing opposition, I would actually respond to their points and to say at least something about their case and show you why it does not work in this particular debate. Okay, let's talk about efficacy. First of all, points that they give, most of the points that they give about difficulty of getting efficient things work against them. Why? Because first of all, if they claim that we need a lot of if the viruses change and are adaptive, it means that we actually need to fast track our implementation of all of the vaccines to get to adapt to changing viruses faster, to get new vaccines every year, probably every half a year, to adapt to those changing vaccines. You cannot scientifically predict how it will mutate. Otherwise, it would have been too easy, and flu shot would not have been every year. It is simply not possible scientifically, and it works against them. Second point also works against them about multi-strains. We show you why in our world there will actually be more types of vaccines, because there will be more companies working on researching those vaccines. It means that it will be much more reliable to produce vaccines that are targeted to certain geography where this particular strain is popular or something like that. And it also works against their case, because we show you why in our case the vaccines will be more adaptive, why they will be more targeted. about difficulty in general of proving efficiency. Like, yes, of course, doing good vaccine is difficult. However, it is doable, and countries, pharma companies do it. It will be done faster, however, in comparison in our world, simply because there will be will not require such amount of testing. It is very simple logic that beats both tables of oppositions. There are two logics actually. First of all, proving just safety is simply easier and faster than proving efficiency as well, because you first of all prove safety in order to even start doing certain mass-scale human actions, human testing that is necessary to prove efficiency, that is necessary to prove efficacy. So you first have to prove safety, and after that only start spending 2 or 3 years to prove efficiency of the vaccine, simply because of that. But even more simplistic second reason why it will be faster, because you only need to do half of the testing. Like, you literally do not have to do another half that works on efficiency. It saves time, it saves money. Therefore, our points stand in comparison to what Kolle opposition says. About their extension on government funding being less. We do not believe it at all, because government funding does not come because politicians are so good and they want to get efficient vaccines. They come because pharma companies lobby them, because Pfizer is one of the top lobbyists in the US politics, and they will still lobby them. They will be profitable. They will be able to get governmental funding, governmental money, and it stays in both of the worlds. We do not agree that government will suddenly become so good and stop listening to lobbyists and therefore get less funding. But even if and moreover, we do not agree with this point simply because even according to their logic, politicians do it because they need to do something with certain illnesses, and they still have to give funding to, if it is beneficial for their political career, for their chances of re-election, they will still continue doing it, even if it will not be efficient in this case. Moreover, we believe that it does not engage at all with our point about changing incentives for private companies, because A, most of the private companies rely on their own funding. B, private companies in any case decide themselves on what to research, because again, politicians cannot force company to research something that will be unprofitable. We show you clear incentives from a profit perspective why this is the case. Okay, moving on to the other tables. Comparing to like some of the refutations that I have given to closing competition also applies to opening competition. For example, when they claim that safety should be ignored or something like that, we believe that it is not the case, because it will not help in this particular debate. But moreover, as closing competition agrees, they have to protect. They have a burden to prove both efficiency and safety, not only efficiency as they are trying to do or something like that. Moreover, about points that the people will be less likely to buy any new vaccines in future. It relies extremely on the idea that vaccines will be ineffective. The vaccines that we are selling will be ineffective. However, it is not true, because Mukhtar already proves you why vaccines will still, in most of the cases, be effective, either because of the competitive pressure or to maintain certain quality, or because it is actually simplistic. It is actually effective process to get effective vaccines. The problem comes from, again, need for testing and need for time for testing. Even their argumentation about pharma companies are trying to push at least something, it does not work in this debate, because pharma companies want to sell not one vaccine, they want to sell like hundreds of vaccines in hundreds of years in the future. Hence, they want their vaccines to be effective, they want them to be quality, and they will not just push any kind of vaccine, because even if it will happen only once, and after that this company will go bankrupt, because in a month the new vaccine that is more effective, much more effective, will come. And Mukhtar has proven you why competitive pressure in this particular case is the most important insurer of quality in most of the cases. So what our case is about, is about ensuring accessibility to vaccines for underprivileged people who currently suffer. Again, we explain you in details why in this world without that does not require testing efficiency as well, why it will be much faster, and why it will be much cheaper. It means again that it will create much higher incentives, profit opportunities for pharma companies to go and research and find new diseases that probably target only people who cannot pay for those vaccines, and to This happens because pharma companies understand that they cannot give a large enough price charge large enough price from them to cover all of the expenses of testing. Testing requires a lot of human resources, human volunteers, requires a long time, therefore it is extremely expensive. And now when we remove this component of pricing structure, it will be much more affordable to underprivileged communities, and therefore it will be much more likely to, in the first place, even happen and start existing. And therefore, we believe that in order to, and moreover, in my refutation to closing competition, I give additional reasons to believe that it will also not only be more accessible to some communities, but it will also be more targeted, and it will be also more adaptive and much better, much faster come to market to respond to all of the threats. And therefore, we believe that this particular motion is necessary primarily in order to make sure that everything works in this case. Thank you.
I thank the government whip, and I'm happy to call the opposition whip. Here.
Hi, I'll just be 1 second. I'm just going to close the window just in my room because it's noisy outside. Thanks. Hello, sorry, I'm back. Okay, okay. 3, 2, 1. There are going to be 3 parts to this speech. First, I'm going to talk about closing government and what their case just was. Then I'm going to talk about our case, impacted out comparing to opening opposition. And if there's anything left, I'll talk about opening government, although I'm pretty sure that Josh already talked about them enough. Okay, so firstly, with regards to closing government, I think that closing government's main case, and they spent 5 minutes analyzing this, and then at the 5-minute mark, eventually got to the impacts in the extension speech, is that rare diseases in status quo don't get vaccines. And once it is economically viable for them now to maybe get vaccines, these rare diseases can get vaccines and will maybe magically be helped. I'm not really sure where that specific link was, but I think that realistically testing for the safety of rare diseases still takes so much time and money. If it's a rare disease, in order to test the safety of it, you're still going to have specific demographics of that population who only have that disease in order to test them. You're not going to be able to just say like, Ebola can now be cured. You're still going to have to get a bunch of people who have Ebola, who might be maybe like in different parts of the world, that you're still going to have to set up research centers in. You're still going to have to go there, and you're still going to have to try and test the safety on them. It's so confusing from closing government when they say that the safety is going to be so easy, going to be so profitable, and it's going to be something that is super easy to do. They assert that it is cheap. It is not necessarily cheap. Realistically, the price difference between the efficacy and safety testing, as already talked about by your opening government, is the time lag. That's the main difference between both of those things. On either side of the house, whether you're testing safety or efficacy, you're still putting a virus into someone. You're still putting a vaccine into someone. You already have gotten to that part on both sides of the house. The only difference is that when you're testing for efficacy, you have to retest them again, maybe a year later, to double check that the antibodies are there, or you have to monitor the antibodies or something like that. You have already gotten to the main bulk of it. Like, a lot of it is already done in terms of you already have put the a little piece of the virus into somebody and to test whether it is safe or efficacy. It's just slightly different things, but you've done the bulk of it. That's why it's not that cheap. Not sure why it's going to be so different. But also, there is just never going to be the profit incentive for these tiny rare diseases if you characterize themselves as being only suffered by a very small amount of the population. Notably, if it is in underprivileged areas and underprivileged countries in which have underprivileged governments, those governments are still not going to be able to magic up the money in order to buy these vaccines, whether they be safe or whether they be effective or whatever. They're still never going to be able to afford them. Not sure where this money is magically coming from, especially when you take Josh's analysis that if it is literally, if a government is more likely to be complacent, and if you literally, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but when you have the fact that private sector is essentially now having free reign and is able to say, yeah, our vaccine's safe, you should take it. They can hike up the price as much as they want, and that means that these governments are even less likely to afford it. But I still think even like initially they will still never be able to afford it anyway. But also just they never explain, like closing government just never explained why these vaccines are ever actually going to work. I think at least at least opening government talked a little bit about why specifically safety might also lead into efficacy as well, although I still think that there are problems with that. But I think in closing government, they just magically assume that safety equals efficacy, and we're never really told why all of these tiny diseases, are they going to be cured? I'm not really sure what the impact is. Their best impact sounded like you get more competition for big pharma. I don't know why this is a benefit. I think big pharma already has enough money. I don't really know. I'm not really sure. I think then the responses to our case are saying that like there exist more types of vaccines because there are more companies working on vaccines. That is a response that I just gave. But we also just think that it's untrue that you have more, like magically a lot more companies because because of the fact that now suddenly you can maybe cure a rare disease. You can already cure a rare disease. This competition already exists in status quo, because if you're analyzing profit incentives in that way, then I'm not really sure why all these companies haven't already sprung up trying to fight all these tiny rare diseases and be a first mover in that field specifically as well, especially if the status quo is just safety. Then I think that then your problem should already be solved and the case doesn't really make sense. I think then also they responded to our government funding mechanism. I'll take a POI at like 5:45, by the way, from opening government if they have one then. I think then with response to our government funding point, I think they misunderstood our mechanism specifically here. The mechanism is that underneath government's best case, if the private sector is like, and already analyze this a little bit, if the private sector is working a lot at producing these like just safe vaccines and not going the extra step to prove that they are
Nicole, you were stuck, I think, for everyone.
Effective. Why would they waste their money?
Yeah.
Oh, did
Nicole?
I drop? What time did I drop?
Now we hear you properly.
I can change my internet connection. Sorry.
Okay, so do you want to do it for a second and then continue? I stopped my watch in 4 and 20 seconds.
Okay, great.
So
thanks.
you have, math is hard, 2 minutes and 40 seconds left.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I changed my internet.
Yeah, great. The last thing, so you have 2 minutes and 40 seconds left.
Okay.
And the last thing I heard from you is that CO didn't understand your mechanism on investment of the government.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, cool. I'll start that again. Okay, yeah, so I think that they misunderstood our mechanism here. Our mechanism here is that underneath government's best case scenario, if the private sector is working away producing these barely safe but not effective vaccines, then that means that like there's absolutely no incentive for the government to pump research and development or to try and solve the efficacy issues of these specific vaccines. What we think that this specifically looks like is that they are not likely to put in this research, this money into research and development, but it also means that they're less likely to do things in future, such as very strong provision of these vaccines, retesting of these vaccines in the future, like making sure that every single person gets a very accurate checkup after the vaccine, because those things are often needed in order to make sure that they are efficacious. We think that this is important. I'll talk more about this right now. We think that actually, what time am I at? Sorry.
5 minutes.
Okay, Grant. I'll take a PY from opening.
So the motion, if you read it, is about regulatory approval. Companies still have to convince governments to buy it. So provided the vaccine doesn't kill people, worst case, we only get a limited amount of immunity. Best case, we can end epidemics like smallpox.
Sure. Okay. So, right. So the issue here about the difference between a little bit of effectiveness and a lot of bit of effectiveness, even if opening government want to say that they get 90% effectiveness as opposed to say 95% effectiveness. Say if you have a population of 1 million people, that is still going to be 50,000 extra people who are unvaccinated and might get a disease, and that still means thousands of people will die. That still means that thousands of children could specifically get like a disease, and that means that like families could be without like members, or you might get people suffering. That means more strain on the healthcare system. If you have a difference of between 90 and 95%, that it's 33, that is like a third more people getting the disease rather than getting the disease before. That means that there's a third more people putting strain on the healthcare system. I don't know why this is like not a meaningful delta, and I don't know why that they never engage with this. This is a massive number of people, even if you just have a small country. With regards to our case, we also just think that other impacts of having of like the specific public response that is going to exist is that you you have a galvanized anti-vaxxer movement. As soon as the fact that you're pumping out vaccines that don't work, you have more people saying, nah, you probably shouldn't, like, you know, trust your government. You also probably shouldn't get a vaccine. That means that you also should probably, like, not wear a mask, etc., etc. Again, this literally leads to more people dying. I think that this is meaningful at the point at which, even if governments say, oh, but like, you're taking an extra year or so to do it, we think that even like that like, because of the fact that on government side, they can never ever prove to you why every single safe vaccine is also effective. Even if one safe vaccine isn't effective on government side, even if that is one, like, literally, that still could mean thousands of people could die, thousands of people could harm, and thousands of people can catch a disease and be and suffer because of it. That is what the anti-vaxxer movement does. But we think in general, this is literally what this motion does. But you have it compounded by things such as movements and such as distrust in the government. We also think that people who rely on government healthcare most are normally people who are minorities, who are often disproportionately affected. Sorry, I'll stop now. By the pandemic. Yeah. Okay, I'm done. Sorry, I've completely lost my time. Thank you. Beg you to oppose.
I think the opposition whip and all the speakers in this round did a great job.